Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast.
A collection of interviews, candid commentary, and general nonsense for the clinical research community.
Check us out at notetofilepodcast.com.
And now, without further ado, on to the show.
All right, guys, welcome to another Note to File. Today is June 18th, 2025, and it's International Sushi Day. What's the best sushi in Wisconsin, Denali?
We're known for our sushi. I don't know if you're aware of that. We have some good perch, walleye.
I'll say they call it bait.
Crappie. I know. We do have some really tasty sushi spots. I mean, I'm not going to say like it's the same as going to like what Oklahoma. They have really big sushi.
I didn't claim we have great sushi spots. And Laura, welcome, Laura. I think probably has us beat when it comes to sushi spots.
Yes, being based in San Francisco, it's actually really hard to find bad food in general, but sushi especially. I'm thinking very much of a favorite spot that I love to do. Like any kind of work dinner, I'm like, let's go there, because it's so much fun.
So I think we need to go. Yeah, I think we need to go film an episode out in San Francisco, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I'm a little bit offended that you didn't invite us to do this on site. So
we could.
Next time.
So, okay, I'm going to open up. I like to open up by asking a little bit about, the backgrounds of our guests. But, I'm going to start with I'm going to throw a wrench in things. I'm going to ask a question, but why do sponsors hate sites?
That's a great question. This is really actually core to why I do what I do, because I think sometimes it feels that way, and that's not okay, right? I think there's hopefully a progression or an evolution away from like site as vendor, and we contract them to do, perform services at market rates and whatever. And of course that's true. Of course, at the core of what we do, that actually is true. I think we are moving in a positive direction. I think you see a lot in the industry around site as partners, and that's grazing, great, and it looks good, feels good. You'll see it on slides, and everybody's like, yeah. But I think what we need to do is kind of trip over the threshold into something much more powerful, which is sites as customers. And so I'm sure we're going to talk about it, but it hurts my heart to hear people think like that sponsors hate sites, because it probably does feel that way.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, I was looking at this earlier today, but about like the whole rhetoric of like sites as partners and this whole concept. And I'm looking at all these, like my LinkedIn feeds full of all these folks at DIA talking about site centricity and all this stuff. But and I've been to DIA a couple of times, on the vendor side of things. Yeah, I don't really know if I've ever talked to any sites at DIA. So it's funny to me that you are at this conference, everyone's talking about we're site centric, we're here for the sites. And it's like, yeah, but the sites aren't here. So like it's like an internal just echo chamber talking about this without actually having the conversations like this, or like what you do, Laura, like where you're actually engaging with sites.
Yeah, I think the industry is getting a little bit better, but it's still very divided. Even again, maybe that's like a weird analogy, like that the conferences are almost the same way. It's like there are site conferences, there are industry conferences, but there's not a lot where you see like a good mix or a fair mix or an equal mix, I guess. It kind of really leans really hard one way or the other. But let me go backwards a little bit, Laura. So and tell us a little bit about, tell us about your journey through, clinical research, what led you there, and kind of a little bit about what you are doing today. I didn't mean to bury the lead there.
That's okay. No, it's great. So I started like a lot of us with a plan, right? I was actually going to school in Wisconsin and was like, pre-med, absolutely. I'm going to join the throngs of all my friends. We love science. Let's just do it all the time. So we're going to, go to med school. And I took the MCAT and I was like, okay, that should play, that will work. But I went to go write my personal statement. I was like, I don't think this is going to work. I actually, it just didn't feel authentic. And so then I shadowed my step cousin in an ER and ended up passing out. That's a funny story for later. But the point is that I was kind of like, maybe not. So I did some basic research, just bench science stuff, and like completely fell in love with the immune system. I was like, this is it. I didn't pioneer anything, but I was, a little bit ago. And so I really got to see some of the precursors to like cancer immunotherapy and was like, this is amazing. And I remember my mom saying like, you should think about being a CRA or doing clinical research. I'm like, I don't even know what that is. Right? Because no little kid is growing up going like, I want to be a trial manager or whatever. And so, with all of that, I got this like once in a lifetime opportunity to go do a contract gig in California. And I was like, oh, all of California is warm and beautiful. And I'm going to have fine. We're going to do this thing for a year, see how it goes. And so that was 18 years ago, 19 years ago. And I discovered
and you're only 25. So
I know,
weird.
really a prodigy. But yeah, not all of California is warm. One, but two, like I drank the Kool-Aid. I started at a large biotech company and started from the ground up. Like, I mean, literally just like processing documents and that kind of thing. And then, managed studies, managed programs, different indications, all the things. And it was amazing. And I kept thinking like, this is fine, but like, how do we really seek areas of high impact, right? Something that we could focus on where there's like a discernible improvement. And so I had this really cool opportunity to start like a study startup group focused in the US at the time, but to really think about like, how do we move the needle on this stuff? And that really started this kind of what I would like to say is a holy impatience about the way that we partner with sites. And I would see firsthand some of the ways that we engage, how we talk about sites, how we talk about what we make sites do. And it really started kind of this back half of my career, really thinking about, okay, yes, strategic partnerships, fine. But also how do we have like a very intentional lift in the overall way that we work with sites? And so I've been at, bigger companies. I had a really fun chapter at a baby biotech where I was, employee number 38. And 28 of us were in the lab. So I've seen some different angles on this. And I think there's a lot of core components that could be true regardless of how large or small you are or your scope of influence. But it's really my passion to kind of transition the industry and the way of thinking away from this very transactional, very impersonal, which is, I think, a little bit of what we're seeing more and more exacerbated, kind of by this predilection around data. But how do we use that to actually improve the relationships? How do we use it as an enabler and not a substitute? Because really what we're navigating is an attention-based economy, and that's true in clinical trials as much as it is anywhere else. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, I want to go back, and you mentioned early on, the concept of site as customer.
Yeah.
I'm curious about it. I've never heard it phrased that way. More, I hear a lot of, and you can tell me how this may be different or the same, but I hear sponsor of choice.
Yes.
Which feels vaguely similar, although, from a different perspective. So talk to me a little bit about sites as customers. We feel this at the site level. We know like we ain't paying for nothing. So nothing is built for us, like at the site level, even though we touch everything. Maybe not everything, but obviously all the data collection comes from sites, until we're in a more decentralized world. So what does that look like? Or how would you sort of lay out that framework?
Yeah. I probably have made versions of this slide many, many, many times. And unfortunately, I kind of like live and dream in slides. But what I'm going to try to articulate is, if we think about a traditional business where we have kind of a company, even a pharmaceutical company, right? You have your company, you have a product, and then there's a number of customers. And so even in a traditional model, we're going to think about product market fit. And it's a little bit different in, a healthcare industry, but it's also kind of not, right? So do your customers really identify with what's differentiated about your product, and do they choose it above and beyond others? And yes, like once we have regulatory approvals and we can see that differentiation in the safety or efficacy profile, yes, okay, fine. But in the clinical trial space, where as yet those assets are actually not proven, right? Technically, we have reason to believe that they could be differentiated, but we don't actually know until we start getting that data. The same is true. So there's an element of the company is still the company, fine. But the product then becomes the clinical trial itself, in the experience of doing that study with that sponsor. So it's even less about the asset per se, although that's a factor. One of my favorite leaders will say there's always kind of a sexy factor for a molecule, and some of them are more compelling than others. But at the same time, even for the assets that are not as yet differentiated, we have an opportunity to create an experience that isn't awful. We could do that. And that then means that product that is a relational component and an experience. And that means that the site is the customer. And frankly, sponsors need sites more than sites need us. They have options, right? I'm sure, Brad, you would say, like, you probably have options to choose from. And, hopefully that is true. Hopefully you don't have, big buckets of unmet medical need in your practice areas. But I think also sponsors have historically kind of thought about this whole game as like, oh, well, they're just going to come to us and we already have the asset. And if we have it available, then they're going to come and they're going to be so grateful. And they'll be willing to kind of navigate these really challenging things like resource limitations and tech on tech on tech. I always have that image of you, Brad, with all of your iPads and phones stacked on each other, because that's real. And so that's where I think we do a disservice to everyone involved, and frankly, to all of the patients and folks that are waiting for these treatment options, by not actually putting on this lens of like, okay, what is product market fit for these customer groups?
So I was going to ask about that. Like, when you're thinking about product market fit, how do you factor in site type? Obviously, there's AMCs, there's independent sites, health systems, site networks. Like, how do you think about that in this model?
And that's exactly it, right? We know that there are a variety of reasons to contribute to a clinical trial. And so some of them are going to be about answering that critical clinical scientific question. And so some of it is going to be about the co-creation, about advancing the science. I think on some level, we're all doing that. But that conversation with, for example, like a university investigator should look different than a conversation with somebody at a community-based clinic where, yes, they super care about the science and like everybody wants to contribute to that, but they are also very much focused on their patient base right in front of them and how this trial is going to be an additive experience and not something that takes them away from what they care about most, which is getting those patients treated. And so even as I think about that conversation, we should be introducing studies based on what is most motivating to sites and demonstrate to them. For example, community clinics, like, hey, listen, you may not have all the resources. We've already thought about that. And here's what we have on offer to support you. Here's some of the things that are optional, by the way. So we're not going to force you into using these things, but just know that they're available. And like, here's a name of a real person you can talk to if you're interested, right? It's not so novel as an approach, except that it is intrinsically relational. And I think that's the piece that people think is too hard to do.
So,
yeah. No, go ahead.
Okay, so what I'm thinking about here is that's between sponsors and sites. How do you manage for that when there's a CRO in the mix then? when you're saying it's relational, it's all about relationship with the sites, but all of a sudden now there's this layer between. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those areas that's absolutely enabled by all of the tech and AI goodness that we are seeing proliferating, right? So in theory, we have this really robust bed of data that could be very, very useful. And we could be reading this data in ways that say, okay, how can we ensure we have institutional memory for anyone who could engage with that site, right? So it could literally be, someone getting an email and saying like, hey, this is Dr. Jones and I have this problem, right? And you could type in JONE and it could figure out, oh, this is Dr. Jones. They're currently doing this many studies, right? That's all navigable if we have this kind of democratized, fully available data. And if we care enough about that relationship to pull it together. I think it exists in a myriad places, right? Not the least of which is in CRA brains and site engagement leads and MSLs and, all kinds of folks, even dare I say in the kind of traditional commercial spaces, right? Yes, we need some bright lines in some cases for very good reasons. And at the same time, it would be useful to know if our engagement is really, really high with a given site versus not as much and how we could influence that.
So essentially you're saying almost the concept of like an industry-wide CRM, right? Because this is like customer relationship management. It sounds a lot like CRM. You're tracking, who's doing what they're, you know something about them. And to your point, like we filled out enough feasibility questionnaires that this data exists. You should know all the things you need to know about us. And that, not just industry-wide, even with one sponsor, it's crazy. Yeah. So I'm a little bit, I don't know, surprised in some ways that doesn't exist, at least in a more robust way. We all probably struggle with this. I have a small company, but there's still a lot of institutional knowledge like in people's heads that's not recorded somewhere.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's crazy that that's the case. And I think to your point, it's not just hurting sites and patients, but it hurts sponsors too. Like, because, to your point, I do have options. And especially when we see drugs come out a lot of times, or drugs being tested, there are, a lot of Me Too's, or a lot of people are chasing the same mechanism of action, or whatever the case may be. So you know what? There's 4 companies running essentially the same study. Yeah. Who do you think I'm going to pick? And who do you think I'm going to want to work with? The one who doesn't make it a pain in the ass when it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And it's just, unfortunately, I feel like that's, I don't know, is it lost on sponsors that that's the case, like truly, or are we just not addressing it head on?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So I think one, to your point, Brad, I don't know that all sites are willing to communicate that, right? And so even something as simple to say, we know behaviorally that like I'll answer an email or a Microsoft Teams chat from my friends before I'm going to go click on the one from this other very difficult person, right? Even though I know like, yes, we have to answer everyone. Okay, so behaviorally, we already know that. But what I see sometimes happen is even when we've very intentionally brought sites to the table and said, we want you to be candid, we need you to be candid, what ends up happening is this very polite, very supportive, collaborative conversation, as opposed to like, yeah, we actually think we're walking away from you pretty soon because we just can't do this anymore. Like there's other options and, we would love to be able to work with you some more, but it's frankly just getting too hard. There's 16 forms to even get into this system and that's like one too many, or 15 too many, right? And so I think we need that level of candor in the conversation, appreciating that there is some risk involved. I think the reason it doesn't happen is because sites don't want to risk not being selected, right? We want to kind of keep that relationship really positive. But then on the flip side, sponsors have to be ready for that feedback and prepared to act on it and to close the loop and say, okay, we've heard that these 15 things need to change. We agree. We're going to start with these ones because it's, feasible, or we think there's going to be the greatest impact. And then we're going to come back with you and actually continue the conversation. So it's not just a one and done. I hear all the time, survey fatigue, sir, you can't, it's never going to work. I'm like, really? Because people keep filling them out. And there's nothing that people care more about than like the friction in their day job that prevents them from being able to do the thing they need to do or the thing they want to do. Right. So I think there's an element of like, we have to lean in. We have to kind of ask ourselves, what else could be true, right? And then be very, we mentioned this echo chamber, very intentional about inviting different opinions and different perspectives, and really like checking to see that we know what we know.
So you made an interesting comment though, because even when they have those conversations, maybe people aren't authentic. And I'm wondering, Brad, why aren't more sites assholes like you?
Appreciate that. I think to Laura's point, a lot of sites are still scared of potential repercussions of being completely honest. And I think, that's unfortunate. I will say, to me, the bar is fairly low. You pointed out something, Laura, I think is people, again, can very much undervalue is that, like, I want to work with people I like if I have a choice. So if you just talk to me like a normal human instead of being like, here's an FQ, it's due in 3 days. Well, what is this? And what are we like, what's going on here? And look, I know like some of these things may not seem particularly scalable, but like I generally, and you'll find probably across many sites, I like working with small companies because I started a study and the project manager texted me, which is like, hey man, just checking in. If you ever have a problem, just let me know. Excited to work with you. That's all it took for me to be like, cool, you know what? They seem to care about what we're doing. They didn't just shove a slideshow in my face and leave. Say, good luck figuring it out. That's not a huge lift, right? Again, maybe it's tough to do if you're a big company working with hundreds of sites. I get it. But nonetheless, even it's sad that like the smallest bit of humanity, like makes that much of a difference.
Yeah. Truly. One of my favorite leaders that I love partnering with has like great quips for everything, right? And one of the things he says is enrollment doesn't happen in data sets, right? And I would add plus that to say it doesn't happen in data sets, it happens at sites, and sites are comprised of people. And if we get really sassy, people are consumers. And so, right, there is a reason why, if I think about a pair of sunglasses, every device I pick up for the next 6 hours is going to show me a picture of that, pair of sunglasses because they want to make a connection, right? And yet, to your point, Brad, we don't even introduce the tiniest bit of humanity, right? To say, hey, I recognize the divine in you. And like, we can just be regular people and do like, right. The enemy is disease. Like we're partnership. Okay. Yes, we're a partnership, right? But we're working together. This doesn't have to be this weird contrarian kind of, tension in the relationship.
Yeah, and I've seen, I don't know, I'm sure maybe you've experienced this. Like I've spent time, even on LinkedIn, I'll reach out to people who have roles like yours to be like, hey, what's up? You guys, like, I'd love to work with you guys. Tell me something. And it's just crickets, a 99 out of 100 times. Yeah, it's weird. Like, is that I guess to like make it a bigger question or point, like what can sites do to help foster that environment aside from be, to Denali's point, not hold back? I think it's, again, you can do it diplomatically. You don't have to curse. You don't have to be quite as maybe provocative as I can sometimes be, but like you still want to be, honest, with sponsors. So like what can sites do to help continue to sort of, or start to further foster that sort of relationship with sponsors? Do they actually want to hear it? I guess is the question. do.
Yeah. What I will say is I absolutely want to hear it. And every time we do some kind of survey or some kind of voice of the customer outreach, we try to create an opportunity to say, hey, listen, if you don't mind giving us additional feedback, like, yeah, sure, we might need a CDA or whatever, but we'd love the opportunity to be able to just ping you randomly with like questions ad hoc and continue that engagement. And we did that once, and we ended up with like over 800 people who were like, yeah, I'll tell you what I think, right? And I think that willingness, that kind of just readiness to be open and be like, I'm available, like just ping me anytime, really fosters that sense of like same team. I think the other thing too, and this might have been a little bit of where you were heading in the previous portion of the question, one thing that I am acutely aware of and thinking about often is this kind of predilection toward, yes, leveraging all of the great data that we have in terms of site performance and, really getting fancy with our predictive models and trying to figure out like, okay, if we change these different components, what is that going to look like?
Yeah.
Both on kind of like a clinical side of things, but also like on the operational side of things. And I think one of the things that is I don't want to say concern, but that's the word that's coming into my head, is that if we're looking for kind of these upper echelon performers, if you will, we risk actually understanding how to improve the performance of some of the smaller sites, right? So if you're only looking for this crew over on this side, one thing that happens is, well, so is everyone else. And so what happens is you have these major geographies that are not well represented, which is a problem for a number of reasons. But the other thing is you don't actually see kind of a differential in, speed, even as a sponsor. And so one thing I'm really curious about is actually, yes, bringing in new sites, and really being intentional about saying like, hey, what does your portfolio look like? What are you most interested in? Let's see where there's mutual alignment, and we can work together on that. But also for those sites that are kind of lesser known, really understanding like, what would it take? Yes, there's limitations sometimes with, your patient base, but at the same time, sometimes there's good reason for why sites are not able to do more. And if we are really intentional about understanding that, then we can make a difference. And I really do think some of the smaller community-based clinics are like the future of what we're doing, right? Even DCT as a concept is meant to kind of distill that and bring, the trial experience as close to home, quote unquote, as possible. And we talk about things like, oh, could somebody be in a clinical trial and on the beach at the same time, right? And I think those are good aspirations. But at the same time, like we have to be very curious about biases in the data, including kind of the reflexive nature of just going to the same large institutions over and over again.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you end up, and it's maybe a bad analogy, but like my daughter plays soccer.
Yeah.
There's an A team and a B team. Well, the A team are your, great performers, right? But they get all the coaching and they get all the best access to everything. Well, the B team, not so much. The B team's never going to catch up to the A team.
Yeah.
And the C team might as well, go play video games. So you end up with an extremely top heavy, situation. And, that's okay. I guess that maybe that makes more sense when it's pure competition, but this is,
Right.
again, the idea is to be against, disease, not against each other. So burning out and competing and only using like your top performers is going to, again, you're never going to be able to build and foster those, the potential of the additional sites, or even the sites that don't even exist yet, to your point. And I agree. I do think, community sites are going to continue to be, the future of clinical research. It's maybe a little bit hyperbolic to say it that way, but I think they're going to have a big impact, going forward. And a lot of those people they're not even doing stuff yet. Right. And I think they're going to be some of the biggest contributors.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a patient panel, gosh, it was years ago now, but it was so interesting to see, three different patients with essentially the same condition, and one of them was saying that they were absolutely ready to participate in a clinical trial, but their treating physician had no awareness whatsoever of a number of the studies, and she was highly motivated and did a bunch of research on her own, and then had to try to navigate the, like, how do I make my way into a trial. Ended up traveling, I think it was 8 or 12 hours each way for visits to go 2 states over. And, okay, happy story that she made it into that trial, which is amazing. But I just could not believe that there would be treating physicians potentially blissfully unaware of clinical trials, and sometimes aware of, but not interested in conducting them because it ends up not being worth it. And so I think that's a huge area. I think a lot of folks are working on that as, trials as treatment and those kinds of things. But it is also kind of like important for us to get to the root of the root and really think about how to, meet folks where they are.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing too, because if you think about, if we're just going back to these same sites, these same geographies, these same locations, that means the representation within the patient population is just not going to be there. You're going to miss huge swaths of different types and of individuals, right? And I know DE&I is a whole thing now, but even from a science perspective, you're not going to get representative samples of the patients in those drugs. It's just sad. I mean, because that's a super self-selected example you just had, right? Like, how many people are going to actually do that and go the extra mile? There's huge segments of the population that are just going to be missed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we still lack, something I think you touched on a little bit in the last podcast and all that, but even just broad education. Again, I see this in the systems I work where maybe more than half of the system doesn't even know research exists, even though we're there doing research. And it's the same building.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've worked with them, reaching out to community physicians and trying to get patients involved. You identify patients within their population who could benefit from a trial. And then it's just an entire, it's a communication and facilitation activity, but half of it's also just education, where it's they haven't heard of research since they were in med school. And now you're having this conversation to be like, hey, your patient could really benefit from this. And just it's an uphill slog.
Yeah. Well, and how do we present all of this information in a way that's actually consumable, right? So what is the TLDR of this? Because we also don't want it to be oh, and here's 200 slides for you to consume and, in your spare time, your discretionary time. It can't be that. It's got to be compelling on its own. And then we have to do everything we can to take all of the friction out of the process.
Yeah, I agree. Well, something I wanted to ask too, again, what can sites do to be more attractive to sponsors? Look, we do, you say sites as customers. I feel like it's sort of sites as employees.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is it's a lot of it checks the same boxes, because here's what I would say is, if you want to retain a good employee, you give them the tools and resources, to do their job. You don't say, you're hired, see ya, good luck, which is what I feel is what happens, right? And so I'm going to quit that job, or at least I'm going to quit that job,
right?
Which is the study is going to sit silently. But on the other hand, we want to be good, employees. We want to be good partners.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who does a lot of site engagement, what are you the traits of successful or desirable sites, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's kind of your standards, right? So when we think about performance, quote unquote, we're looking at the fundamentals of speed, enrollment, data, getting the data in, and that is the end game for any clinical trial is having that data to understand how we are able to answer the scientific question. That said, one of the things that I think we could do a lot better job of is saying, is being really transparent about what we're doing. And one of the things that I'm trying to, kind of introduce a bit more of is bringing in historical information into the conversation in like a feasibility conversation, right? So if we approach a site for feasibility in the kind of the very traditional model, we say, hey, we have this study, are you interested, right? And then if so, answer way too many questions, a bunch of them are repeated, and okay, fine. And then we do this game where you all, as the site, might artificially inflate your patient numbers so that you can be selected.
I would never
Then
do that.
never, ever. But some people, right? We can imagine a scenario where maybe this could happen because you do want to actually do the study. That's the thing.
Yep.
You're genuinely interested. And so you're like, okay, what's going to be compelling? Okay, this number, right? And maybe it's loosely based on what you actually think you can do, but you're very intentional about like, okay, we think this is going to be one that's going to get a yes. Then on the sponsor side of things, we say, okay, let's cut that in half or a third or a tenth, because we think that sites all overinflate their number, which is not great, right? We're already operating from that assumption. But then from there, we go through this exercise of like, well, we've got to put it in a system, in this database, and the numbers have to add up, and it's got to be quite clean, you see, and we can't have any overages, and it all has to like be rationalized. So what ends up happening is the site commitment, what you say you are going to be able to do, is not even remotely related to the number that goes into some system or the contract or anything like that, right? And then we embark on this trial and everybody goes, well, why, there's all this finger pointing and different things happen. So what I would love to see is a lot of like, hey, we believe this commitment to be X, and we know that it may not be as high as other sites, but we are absolutely committed to delivering it. We probably can do more, but we want to be conservative in our estimate because we want to make sure that you have the predictability, the reliability that you want. Right. And that's basically why we do all of these simulations and invest in all this stuff, because we need to be able to understand when this is actually going to read out and manage resource and all of those things. So it is a both and, right? I think it's a bit of saying like, we have to kind of stop the cycle. And I'm thinking very specifically of a site I used to work with, which is kind of old news now. But it was a site in like the middle of nowhere, Illinois. And I'm telling you, if they said 8 patients, they would have 8 or 9, maybe 10, but never 2, never the absolute worst, which is 1, and never 0, because they wouldn't take a study that they didn't do. And so if you ask me where to go, I'd say 100% you need to have this site on your list. And that, again, it's a relationship based in transparency. But it goes both ways. And I know that it's hard. Like, how would you interrupt that cycle if you can't even get on the phone with a real person?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we're playing like a weird game of poker with like everyone at the table, but everyone at the table are other sites that we don't know what they're submitting. If they're submitting a high number, we might not get picked. So if instead the dealer was like, hey, here's the deal, guys, we want to see a commitment of 3 patients per site. Can you commit to that, instead of this weird game of like, you guess, we'll subtract.
Right.
We don't even know what we're really being held like accountable for at that point. Like, again, it's like, it's crazy. Like, why start from a place of complete obscurity? And I know, again, I think the system has sort of bred this weird environment where, yeah, you've got to make a bid that have no idea what the expectation is, because there's no one to tell you. It's just, again, here's a form, fill it out. Cool. Let's look as good as we can. We're not trying to lie. We don't want to lie. We don't want studies that we can't enroll either. It's
exactly
bad. It's bad for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and incentivize is probably a pretty loaded term, but like, how do we introduce the right measures that are actually going to drive what you want to see, right? So can we explore things like, I don't know, an accuracy bonus or something, right? Where there's an element of like, okay, if you're way off in either direction, both are actually problematic, right? But if we could actually use the information. And if, for example, we receive a feasibility back and it says 20 on there, and we have enough institutional memory to go, that's strange. They've literally never enrolled more than 4. Then you have a conversation, right? Is it more like 4 or 5? Can we count on you for 4 or 5? Because in oncology, we need every single, I mean, we always need every single, but it looks a little bit different. That's a dialogue then that we could be having, as opposed to saying like, oh, that's not this threshold, and so therefore we're automatically not.
And like for us as a site, I mean, incentive, again, context of that word aside, but like oftentimes for us, it's more of a implied that we're building a relationship. If we do what good by you, you're going to bring us more study opportunities. But even that is not explicit, right? Like that may never happen. You could do a great. I don't know what's going into your system that says what we did or didn't do. Again, it's just a complete lack of the transparency to know, are we doing good? Do they like us? Like, I need some feedback here.
Well, and remember back in the day, I mean, I feel like I'm totally dating myself, but there used to be these newsletters, right? And they'd be like real time, like, oh, this is, so-and-so is on the leaderboard and all of that other stuff, right? And so appreciating that not every site is going to be managing metrics the way that we do. Each sponsor should have institutional memory, right? And to be able to say, hey, listen, we've been looking at your site activation cycle time, and we've been looking at your enrollment rate. And did you know that actually you've improved by X% over the last 2 years? This is amazing. Also, this is where you're sitting relative to peers, just for awareness, and so then you have these very focused conversations around like, wow, your enrollment's phenomenal. Your data entry needs work. How could we support you in that, right? Are you open? Is your institution open to having, some staff support in that regard? Or is that something we could look at, right? Then you're having the actual, proper conversation.
And I've worked at sites where like we had a relationship with a big device sponsor, and they did that. They come in every month. They'd show us our metrics blinded against, their other sites. But to get that level of, relationship, we had to become a preferred site, which is like, how do you become a preferred site anyway? I didn't know they were already had that relationship when I started that site. So again, and I've seen some companies try to hire these sort of more, I don't like site liaisons. Of course, they'll have different titles where they do a little bit of this. It's maybe not quite so metric driven. It's more sometimes softer touches, but I feel like I see it rolled out and I see it kind of get retracted. Like, is there is there not a clear enough ROI like for sponsors to invest in that? Or like, why have we not seen something like that? Everyone has like account managers or salespeople. Like why are sites don't really get that?
Yeah. I think it's really hitting on the sustainability piece, right? And I hear all the time, like, okay, well, that's just not scalable. There's no way that we could have that level of engagement across the board. So this is my continuous curiosity is like, how could we, right? And so I think there's an element and, just a nod to agentic AI. A lot of it is really just gathering all of the history and kind of having at the ready, like the things you need to talk about. If we had that, I think that, a local study manager, whatever acronym we're going to use for the company, right? They're probably not managing more than 150 sites at a given point in time. I've sent 150 emails. It's absolutely navigable, right? Can you spend all day and all night digging up data from some manila file folder? No, right? So we need to actually leverage the data that we have. But I think it's about intention. Even if it's something to say, okay, out of all of these different sites, I can see that these sites are, reliable. Let's just say that they make a commitment, they usually deliver on that commitment. We already know that there are not that many escalations. We just have like a really good relationship, right? That's good. Keep that relationship warm and all of that. But if there are sites where it is a massive commitment and there's risk to delivery, if that's not met, Or if the commitment looks wildly different than anything that they've done, you can be more intentional to say, hey, how can we support you? Or, with some signal seeking, again, AI is, I think, going to change the game on this, to be able to say, you were supposed to activate in, I'm making it up, 3 months, right? It's been a month and you haven't submitted to IRB. Is there something else that we can help with, right? Are you not getting your questions answered, et cetera, et cetera? But it focuses the energy, because otherwise, you're right. If we're using Excel documents and, sending emails back and forth in perpetuity, we're not going to see that change. But I mean, Chad and I are very good friends. That's how I start almost every single communication that I'm drafting, slides included, all of that. And then I make it mine. But I will say, how do I communicate fill in the blank thing, right? And it takes out that 80% of the effort to start from zero. So similarly, I think there's an opportunity here.
Yeah,
So
I think that's, go ahead.
Go.
No, I think that's great. I think because I think that data exists somewhere and sites don't know it. I mean, I can't tell you. I think once in the last year I had a sponsor even like do a kickoff call after award just to be like, hey guys, let's plot out and plan. Actually, I take it back. There's one sponsor that does it every time. And they're a device. I don't know why device seems to get it right sometimes more often than pharmaceutical, but we have a call. My budget and contract person is there. My regulatory, my ops people are there. Their people are there. We go through and we say, okay, our target date is this time. Our target date for this is this time. Our target date for this is this time. 99% of the time, otherwise, I just get an email with zip files that say, here's a bunch of zip files, start filling out documents, go. And there's no organization to it at all.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I was going to say that because I've seen it on the other side of things where sponsors and CROs have this data and they use it internally for their own processes, and they're well aware of it, and they know who those high risk sites are. They know who's struggling. They know who's their leaders. But then it's like just not that extra step of communicating it down to sites. I just haven't seen happen. Clearly, Brad has neither.
And this is where that site as customer, although, kind of sensationalist potentially, I think that's the shift, right? And when you said, Brad, like, you don't know why devices, I thought, I wonder if it's because it feels like a product.
Yeah.
It's like an actual thing you can have and hold, and there's something very tangible about it, as opposed to this, like, you're participating in a trial. Trials take a long time. It's kind of this, arrangement that we have, and, but it's not seen as like, oh no, the way that we show up in every engagement, to your point, out the gates, perhaps the most important one, every time we show up, that's a way that we represent the company and the product. Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, I haven't considered that. Well, either way, I mean, I think it's nice. I mean, that there are some, I don't know, examples or templates out there, I think. And, hope to see that stuff get carried over a little more. I know we're getting down to the last, under 10 minutes here. You got anything, Denali?
No, I mean, I think this has been great. I think it's fascinating to see. And I think I'm going to get on this soapbox every once in a while. And I think it's nice to see it permeating across the industry about the value of people and relationships. And you can do all of these other things, but there are some things that are just, you can't replace. And like, you can certainly augment and accelerate and make significantly better with tools and with solutions, which I think, like, to your point, like, someone can't send all emails and dig all that up, but with tools they can, but that person is still in the seat. And I think particularly in the site space too, where it is so personal, you're dealing with patients day in and day out. And so that's never going to go away. And I think sometimes that gets lost as you get farther and farther away from that. And so it's nice to hear that, there are people out there who are focusing on this and identifying that, like, relationships matter and we should invest in that.
Exactly. Can I take this opportunity to ask you a question, Brad? Is that okay? Okay.
No. No, by all means.
I'm wondering, there are some things that feel like perennial challenges where, for those of us who've been hanging out for a few decades, we're like, are we really still talking about this, right? But one of the things that I think has been a continuous challenge or something that's kind of emerging is this proliferation of, tech, all the devices, we kind of talked about it earlier. I'm wondering, without naming names, what when you're thinking about a sponsor that does it really well, what are the things that they've done to kind of solve for the pain that most of us experience in this like very congested, and sometimes necessarily so, but sometimes not, but this very congested tech landscape? Is there anyone that's kind of solved for what we've called at times like the digital front door, that component of things? I live, in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and I met someone at a conference that was like, listen, we've solved it. And I was like, have you? Or do you have like an idea around it, right? But I'm just curious if there's anyone who's doing this really well and what we could learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say that I don't know. I mean, I haven't really seen a lot of examples where I've been like, this is it.
Yeah.
And now I think we're getting closer to it. But I mean, even just minimizing fragmentation like as much as you can.
Yeah.
And even beyond that, look, I've sort of like accepted this is just the reality. We're dealing with all this stuff. It's okay. But I think if a sponsor will take the time to even just like, have you considered how these things fit together as a sponsor?
Yeah.
It seems like you haven't, because you can't tell me how they fit together.
Yeah.
If you can, and you can at least lay out what needs to happen where and when, that goes a long way. I used to do studies that well, maybe that's overstating it, but like I've seen studies that have like very simple manuals of operation. So like just how to navigate these different, not how to use them necessarily, but how they fit together.
Yeah.
That goes a long way, because it's extremely unclear. Some things integrate, some things don't. Some things have to be done in order, some things don't. That's where it gets challenging. I can log into 3 different platforms. I'm not an idiot. Like, it's easy to do that. It's that I needed to get a subject number from IRT before I could put that in EDC. Or no, actually the EDC generates it for me, but they need to be pre-screened in this other system first. So I need to do that. That carries over here, but this doesn't carry over. So just give me a diagram,
Yeah.
like if you're going to insist on using 10 systems, show me how they are supposed to work together.
Yeah. And 100%
Eventually-
we have those, right? That's the thing that's kind of killing me a little bit, is like we have to figure that out, but they usually sit somewhere in like a tech landscape, as
Right.
opposed to saying, okay, how do you rationalize this with, only the details that you actually need to say, okay, this is what it's going to look like for this study, and even a little bit of why it matters. To your point, we know that in a lot of ways you probably know things better than we do, because you see all of these different systems and tools and all of that. But I think a bit of explaining the why also can go a long way. Of like, we know we have 3 different vendors for fill in the blank, but this is why.
I think it goes back to that just piece of humanity to it. And like, I've been lucky to be able to do this because I can talk to people and realize I gain more and more sympathy over time, as much as I may not seem that way. But like, you start to understand like why things are the way they are, and it becomes maybe a tinge more bearable in your day-to-day life when you remember like, oh, well, this is why. At least I know. But I don't think most coordinators do not have that advantage, because they're busy figuring out how systems work together instead of talking to people about it.
Yeah.
So sometimes
And
just
we
something
don't
as
hate
simple as an
sites.
explanation. I know I was being a little silly there.
I know, but we shouldn't act like it, right? You should be able to tell that we actually really appreciate sites and we super care. And that's the point, is that even if it's like we can't solve for every tech conundrum, we can't, I think sometimes it feels like there's not a lot of agency for folks in different roles. But what's the one thing that you could do? What's the email that you could send, or, heaven forbid, a phone call that you could make to say, hey, listen, we're going to leave you an old-timey voicemail. You may not remember what those are, but we're just going to say, hey, thanks for participating. Like, let me know if there's anything I can help you with. Here's a number.
Sure.
It doesn't take that much.
No, I agree. Well, very good. Where can people find you online, Laura?
Probably LinkedIn is the easiest. I'm trying to embrace all of the social platforms. I kind of like this idea of taking very regular digital Sabbaths and those kinds of things. And so I'm like, oh, it's this necessary evil. But yeah, I think LinkedIn is the easiest.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. What do we got next week, Denali?
We got a sticky notes a week from today, same time, same day, same place. So don't know what we're talking about, but I'm sure we'll find some things to run our mouth about.
Yeah, always.
Always.
All right, Laura, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching, guys. See you next week. Thanks for listening to Note to File. We're committed to continuing to bring you independent and unfiltered coverage of the clinical trial industry.
We want to talk about what you want to hear. So if you have something on your mind, hit us up at notetofilepodcast.com.